toward a new worldview, circa 1540 to 1789. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the educated elite of Europe changed their view of the world from a religious view to a secular scientific view. What that statement means, in other words, is that in the 1600s and 1700s, a small group of educated Europeans changed their view of how they felt the world and the universe operated from a view which emphasized God and faith as an explanation for the workings of the universe and everything within it, to a more rational, scientific view of the world which emphasized explanation, provable explanations. This change in worldview is due to two events in world history: the scientific revolution of the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s, and the Enlightenment of the 1700s. It is difficult to define exactly what is meant by the scientific revolution and what is meant by the Enlightenment, but just briefly to give you a little overview, the scientific revolution is a period of about 200 years in which men who are calling themselves scientists and philosophers are willing to stand up and challenge the traditional beliefs of the Catholic Church and the educated elite. These men are Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Newton. Those are the major figures of the scientific revolution, and we'll talk about the contributions of each man to the scientific revolution in just a few minutes. The Enlightenment was a period that emphasized philosophy, education, new ways of thinking about things, progress, put emphasis on using science to explain everything from human behavior to politics. So these two movements influenced the change in worldview. As we talk about the major figures and their contributions to each period, you will better understand what we mean by the terms scientific revolution and enlightenment. Since we're talking about the new worldview from 1540 to 1789, it would probably be a good idea to start with the old worldview so that we know how this worldview changes between 1540 and 1789. So let's back up a bit. Before 1540, the view of the world held by the educated elite was based on the theories of the ancient Greek philosopher and teacher Aristotle, who lived between 384 and 322 BC. Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher and teacher, proposed a theory of the universe called the geocentric theory, in which he stated that the earth was fixed, it did not move, and that the sun and moon revolved around the earth. He was not without challenge. Another Greek philosopher by the name of Aristarchus, famed for his inventions, proposed the heliocentric theory, which said that the sun was fixed at the center of the universe and that the earth revolved around the sun. People in ancient Greece thought Aristarchus was mad. There was no possible way that the earth was moving. They did not see that, nor did they feel it. Therefore, they believed that Aristotle was correct because every day they saw the sun move from east to west. So Aristotle's geocentric theory, which was not correct, was accepted as fact from his lifetime, the 4th century BC, until 1540 AD. If we add those together, the time span we see is nearly 1,900 years. So for the better part of 2,000 years worth of Western history, people believed that the earth was fixed and did not move. In other words, they believed Aristotle's geocentric theory. By 1540, science had become a branch of religion. Science was, in fact, very religious. The official belief of the Catholic Church was the geocentric theory. So, for someone like Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Newton to stand in defiance of the Catholic Church requires a great deal of bravery, because in this period, challenging the church and any of its popularly held beliefs could result in a charge of heresy, which could ultimately lead to banishment or exile or excommunication from the church, or even possibly execution. So, by 1540, the Catholic Church had taken science and made it very religious. Here's a further explanation of that. The official belief of the Catholic Church and of the educated elite of the time was the belief that the universe was comprised of 10 crystal spheres. Inside one crystal sphere was the earth, which was fixed and motionless. Beyond the sphere which held the earth were other spheres which held inside them the known planets. There were 5 known planets in this time period. There was also a crystal sphere which held within it the sun, another that held within it the moon, another that held the stars, and 2 extra crystal spheres that housed things such as comets. And beyond the 10th crystal sphere, it was believed, was the home of God and the souls of the saved. These crystal spheres, 9 of them moved. 1 did not. The crystal sphere which held inside it the earth, placing God's most important creation, earth and human beings, right fixed smack in the center of everything, remained fixed. The other crystal spheres rotated in perfect circles thanks to angels who were moving these crystal spheres around the earth. As you can see, science was not very scientific in this period. The first philosopher and scientist of the scientific revolution was a Polish clergyman turned astronomer, Copernicus, who lived from 1473 to 1543. In his research, Copernicus rediscovered Aristarchus' heliocentric theory. He popularized the heliocentric theory among the scientists of the time. The heliocentric theory, as we stated before, was the belief that the sun was fixed and that the earth rotated around the sun. Copernicus is given credit for what's called the Copernican hypothesis, published in 1543 in On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. The Copernican hypothesis is essentially the assumption that the sun was the fixed center of the universe and that the earth and the known planets rotated around the sun. What this suggested was that the universe was huge and of staggering size. If something as big as the earth was moving, and it was moving around something as big as the sun, it boggled the mind. The universe was staggeringly large, possibly infinite. In other words, never-ending. Copernicus was very careful to publish his beliefs, his hypothesis, as a theory, as a belief, as a hypothesis, as a suggestion, not as a fact. And he waited until the last year of his life to publish his work. It's almost as if Copernicus knew the end of his life was near. He felt himself growing weak and old and sick and decided to publish his findings in 1543. You might suspect the reason why he waited until the last year of his life was that if he got convicted on heresy charges, he kind of felt like, well, I'd lived my life, it's no big tragedy. But that's not true. The reason why he waited until 1543 was to avoid the ridicule of his fellow scientists. He was afraid that by saying the heliocentric theory was a possibility and that the universe might be infinite, that he would be the object of ridicule, that his fellow scientists, quote-unquote, would think he was a bit nuts. So Copernicus published On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres in 1543. Never did he say the heliocentric theory was anything other than a theory or a possibility, but he certainly believed that it was true. Kepler, who was from the Dutch Netherlands, lived between 1571 and 1630. He came to most of his ideas not through research or experimentation, but by simply thinking and observing the night sky with a naked eye. And it's really amazing that someone could have such mental aptitude to come up with laws of planetary motion based on just thinking with no way to prove it at all, and to have these things actually turn out to be true is really quite amazing. Kepler proposed 3 laws of planetary motion. These laws include the following ideas. Kepler said he believed, though he had no proof, and he was careful to say these were just ideas to avoid the wrath of the church. He said he believed that the planets revolved around the sun. Possibly they did, perhaps they were moving, and if they did in an elliptical fashion, not in perfect circles. He also said that the time of orbit of a planet was relative to its distance from the sun. In other words, the time and speed of a planet around the sun is not uniform. It varies from planet to planet. Kepler published these ideas simply as that, ideas. He never dared to suggest that they were facts, but in actuality, Kepler was right. Galileo was an Italian astronomer who lived from 1564 to 1642. His most important contribution to the scientific revolution was the law of inertia. Galileo, unlike Kepler and Copernicus, stated that the law of inertia was a fact, which got him convicted almost on heresy charges. He was brought in before the Catholic Church on an Inquisition hearing in 1633. More about that in a second. Why is Galileo in trouble in 1633? What is the law of inertia? Galileo accepted the beliefs of Kepler and Copernicus as factual, and he was trying to offer an explanation as to how the planets would revolve around the sun if they were not in fact moved in perfect circles by angels. He observed through various experiments a naturally occurring law of motion in the universe called inertia, in which he stated shortly and simply that a body in motion remains in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. According to Galileo, it was a naturally occurring fact of the universe that objects moved, including the planets, around the sun. Fact, he said. So in 1633, the Catholic Church hauled Galileo in before an Inquisition hearing on a charge of heresy for going against the official beliefs of the Church. When asked if Galileo believed in the heliocentric theory, of course he does believe that, he said no. When asked, does the planet Earth move around the sun, he said no, definitely not. Asked, was the law of inertia a fact? He said no, definitely not, just a theory. So in some ways, Galileo is a disappointment in that he doesn't stick up for what he truly believes, but it was to preserve his own life, so I guess we have to give him a little bit of a break. He was given a slap on the wrist, more or less, in 1633 and told by the Catholic Church, if you continue to publish, make sure that you say your ideas are just those, ideas. Galileo did so and did not get in trouble with the Church again. Sir Isaac Newton is the last scientist of the scientific revolution that we're going to talk about. He lived from 1642 to 1727. He was an Englishman, a professor of optics at one point, a member of Parliament, very rational, scientific guy, mathematical genius, would lock himself away for days at a time, working on math problems just for the fun of it. People in his own lifetime recognized his mathematical genius. But this extremely rational scientific man also had an interesting other side to his personality. To be so rational and scientific, he also believed in magic, like alchemy, turning base metals into gold and silver. He also believed it was possible to find some sort of potion or elixir of life that would give a person immortality or eternal life. So, to be so rational, he was involved in some interesting hobbies or sidelines. When asked about his genius and how he came to his mathematical system, Newton said, "If I have seen farther, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants," which is a very humble way to respond to someone complimenting him on his genius. What he was saying is that he was giving credit to the men before him, like Aristotle, Aristarchus, Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo, that without these men and their contributions, he would have had to start in the beginning and would not have been able to focus on what he focused on, which was attempting to explain the universe mathematically in a series of mathematical equations. What Newton came to while locking himself away for days at a time trying to explain the universe by math was the mathematical system called calculus. Of course, it was so complicated for the time that people did not get it completely, and some still don't. But it was about 200 years after Newton before people really truly began to appreciate and understand what he had came up with these ideas of calculus. And more or less, one of the first individuals to truly get what Newton had come up with, the mathematical system of calculus, was Einstein. So it took a genius to unravel the work of a previous genius. So Newton is famed for the discovery of gravity and the law of universal gravitation, which he wrote about in his famous work Principia, or Principia if you prefer the Latin pronunciation, published in 1687. By the time of Newton, many of the educated elite of Europe had started to accept the heliocentric theory as fact, that the planets revolved around the sun in an elliptical fashion, that the time of orbit was relative to distance from the sun, that the speed of an orbit was not uniform from planet to planet, that the law of inertia worked, that the planets moved not because of the angels, but what they could not wrap their mind around was that if the natural state of planetary bodies like the Earth is motion, what holds the universe together? If the natural state is motion, why don't planets just revolve and spin off? Why do they stay together, clustered around the sun? The answer, according to Newton, was the law of universal gravitation, and specifically gravity. Newton brought together in what's called the Newtonian synthesis all of the ideas of Kepler, Galileo, and Copernicus, and added to them the law of universal gravitation. Essentially, what Newton did was he provided the glue that made the universe stick together. That glue was gravity. He said that all bodies push and pull on each other with force. That force is gravity, and it's gravity, this pushing and pulling of every individual object on every other individual object, that keeps it all together. The law of universal gravitation was very complex and not fully understood at the time, but is the basis today for scientific research in terms of astronomy. The causes of the scientific revolution are complex, but we'll summarize them here. Many individuals like Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Newton were motivated in this period on the sheer basis of curiosity, an attempt to explain the unknowable, a desire to know how things worked other than the simple explanation they work because God made them, which had been acceptable before 1540 as an explanation for anything and everything. Universities also encouraged scientific research in this period. Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton were either students at or professors at, and sometimes both, student and professor at universities. Universities encouraged scientific research. Protestantism in this period was pro-science. partially because the Catholic Church was anti-science. Protestants and Catholics are always on the opposite side, it seems. So in this period, Catholics feared that as people became more scientific, they would fall away from the church and not believe in religion anymore. Protestants felt that by studying science, individuals would become more religious because they couldn't help but see God's hand and God's handiwork in everything. Also, a cause of the scientific revolution was the need for better navigational tools as Europe makes its way across the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans in trading with colonies established in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. There are two main results of the scientific revolution: the development of the scientific community, a group of scientists like Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, who can call themselves scientists because they have scientific training and because they can find jobs or employment as scientists at universities. It is also in this period that, thanks to Bacon and Descartes, we have the modern scientific method. Before the scientific revolution, some individuals who called themselves quote-unquote scientists often sat around and theorized without trying to prove their ideas. They just came up with ideas about how they thought things might work, but they never experimented to try to prove their theories, so their theories were useless. Other scientists conducted experiments and just collected the data and wrote down the data and then never tried to see patterns or interpret results from the experiments. Neither of those approaches works. The idea of bringing together experimentation and theory into the scientific method is attributable to Bacon and Descartes, and the scientific method includes the following steps, which you may be familiar with from science class. We owe these to Bacon and Descartes and to the scientific revolution. First, a person who is conducting an experiment must have a hypothesis, an educated guess, theory, idea about what they expect to find. They may do research to see what others have said. They conduct the experiment, observe, collect the data, and then interpret the data to prove or disprove the hypothesis. The other reason for the change in worldview among the educated elite from 1540 to 1789 was the Enlightenment of the 1700s. As we said previously, the Enlightenment is an intellectual and cultural and artistic movement which focused on three basic ideas: progress, the scientific method, and that science can explain everything. This movement, called the Enlightenment, reached its height or its peak of development in France. And the writers of the Enlightenment in France are called philosophes. That's philosopher without the R. Philosophes in France had as their goal, as writers of the Enlightenment, to educate the public, not the masses. They wanted to educate a group of people they called the public. They defined the public as the educated people. So they wanted to educate the educated, not the masses or the indiscriminate majority of people who were uneducated, and they felt, that is the philosophes felt, that the masses who were uneducated were too superstitious and too uneducated, too stupid, if we want to go that far, to really get their brilliant ideas. So what were the brilliant ideas of the philosophes? Well, the philosophes stressed in their books and in their teachings and discussion three basic ideas. Progress is possible, meaning that through education, better people and better societies can be created. They also believed that the scientific method was key to understanding human behavior. In other words, you could take the scientific method and conduct experiments on people and predict human behavior. This gives rise to a new branch of study called the social sciences, which includes political science and psychology. The philosophes also believed that science can explain everything from human behavior to religion. One of the philosophers was a political philosopher by the name of Montesquieu. He believed that science could be used to explain politics. So we could call him a political scientist. His most famous work and most influential work was published in 1748, and it was called The Spirit of Laws. This book has profound impact in Montesquieu's home country of France, but was also read by the founding fathers of our country, and we see in our Constitution the ideas of Montesquieu, the French philosopher of the Enlightenment. In The Spirit of Laws, published in 1748, Montesquieu stated that in a perfect government, in a government that works, power checks power. Montesquieu was calling for the creation of governments throughout Europe and even in his home country of France, which was an absolutist country, to end absolutism everywhere and to establish constitutional governments which separated and checked the power of various branches of government. In other words, Montesquieu said that in an absolutist country like France, having only an executive branch of government did not work because it did not keep the power of the king in check. The whim of the king became law. So he suggested in The Spirit of Laws that in a perfect government you would have a constitution, a constitutional state, and in this constitution there would be a separation of the branches of government into executive, judicial, and legislative, and each of these branches would have methods of checking and balancing the power of the other two. Therefore, no branch of government would become too powerful. This idea impacted the French people, who saw that their government did not have a system of checks and balances. Instead, the whim of the king was law. This idea of checks and balances influenced the foundation of our Constitution and our country, and we know that the executive, judicial, and legislative branches in our Constitution are able to check and balance each other, for example, through veto. Voltaire was a French philosopher who lived from 1694 to 1778. Voltaire was his pen name. Voltaire was a deist. He was, in other words, not a Protestant or a Catholic. He was a Christian who believed in a distant, uncaring God, a God who created the universe and then lost interest. Voltaire's religious beliefs, along with his sharp tongue, got him into trouble, and he was actually, on a number of occasions, put in jail and at one point exiled from the country of France. Voltaire felt that he had been discriminated against because of his religious background. Voltaire campaigned for, in the country of France, legal equality. He felt that he had been mistreated because of his religious beliefs. Voltaire stressed that in France and in every other country, a person's background should not matter. The punishment should be the same for the crime across the board, that the court should be blind to a person's ethnicity, race, to their educational level, to their religious beliefs or lack thereof. None of that should matter. The punishment for the crime should be the punishment for the crime. So, Voltaire campaigned for legal equality and was opposed to legal injustice. This idea also impacted the French, who realized that legal equality did not exist in their country. So far, what I would just say to you about Montesquieu and Voltaire is their ideas may not seem very revolutionary to us as modern-day Americans, but in the time period, what Montesquieu and Voltaire are suggesting here are truly, literally revolutionary ideas. Their ideas impact both the American and French revolutions. Voltaire is famed for his work about a morally corrupt young man named Candide, which from time to time is on and off the banned books list. He also wrote a historical work about the reign of Louis XIV called The Age of Louis XIV, published in 1743. Rousseau was a French philosopher who lived from 1712 to 1778. Rousseau's major contribution to the Enlightenment were two books, The Social Contract, published in 1762, and a work about child rearing, published in 1762, also called Emile, which was so controversial that it was actually burned by people publicly shortly after its publication. After people had enough time to read it, basically, they started burning it. More about Emile in just a second. Rousseau's Social Contract stated that a government and its subjects have a contract. A contract is an agreement. What the government agrees to do for its subjects, this is, by the way, an unwritten contract, according to Rousseau. A government has a contract with its people. It knows what it's supposed to do, and that is look out for the interests and needs of the people. In return, what the people do, or the subjects of the government, is they give it loyalty and respect. From time to time, according to Rousseau, governments did not uphold their end of the contract. They ceased to care about their subjects and became more obsessed with gaining power and making the government more powerful, more influential. According to Rousseau, when the government acts that way and doesn't care about the people, and he was suggesting this was happening in France, where the tax burden was falling heavily on the poor people who were the least able to pay taxes. What Rousseau says is when a government does not do what's right for the people, loses interest in the people, becomes more obsessed with increasing power of the government, the contract becomes null and void. The government isn't doing its part, the people don't have to do theirs, meaning they don't have to be loyal. They have, according to Rousseau, the right and responsibility to revolt at that point. Rousseau's ideas were popular in France just prior to the French Revolution, and the Social Contract was also popular reading in the American colonies and impacted the American Revolution. Emile, we'll talk about for just a second. Emile was a book by Rousseau about child rearing practices, and this is extremely hypocritical. More about what I mean on that in just a second. Rousseau said in 1762 that children should be treated tenderly, with compassion, as human beings, because it was commonplace in Europe at this time for upper-class women and middle-class women to have children but not breastfeed or nurse them themselves, to hire poor women to do that. Basically, upper-class and middle-class women were not interested in raising their children themselves because the infant mortality rate was so high. So many children died that parents were reluctant to form emotional attachments to their children. And as a result, children were often neglected, sometimes brutally treated, more or less ignored, and dressed in really outlandish, adult-looking clothing, which restricted their movements. Rousseau suggested that upper-class women and middle-class women should breastfeed their own children because it was healthier for the child. He also suggested that education should be tailored to a child's gender. Boys should get plenty of exercise and fresh air, be taught how to read and to do a trade. Girls, on the other hand, and by trade I mean do a job, girls, on the other hand, he said, should be treated gently and given a practical education based on their gender. In other words, girls should be taught how to grow up to be good wives and mothers. This is a bit hypocritical because Rousseau actually had 5 children with a common law wife, meaning he never officially married her. These 5 children he never raised or never really had any contact with. Once he fathered these 5 children, the mother begged and pleaded with each child to be able to keep it. Rousseau refused and made her, the mother of his children, give up all 5 to what was called a foundling home or foundling hospital. That's just another word for orphanage. So for Rousseau, it was more important to write about how to raise children than to actually raise them himself. John Locke, I'm going to mention here to you as a member of the Enlightenment. He is not, however, from France. He was from England, so you should make a note that one of the major Enlightenment philosophers outside of France was the Englishman John Locke, who lived from 1632 to 1704. His important works are an essay concerning human understanding and 2 treatises of government. John Locke is important because he suggested in his works multiple ideas which, yes, impacted both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. He, too, suggested that government should exist to protect the natural rights of human beings, natural rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, that it was the right of the people to have these basic human rights because they were human beings, and it was the job of the government to ensure protection of these basic human rights. He also contributed to the idea of child rearing, just like Rousseau. John Locke had some ideas about how to raise children. According to John Locke, civilization has a corrupting influence on people, that essentially if we could avoid each other, we would all stay basically good. At our core of our being, we would be great people if we didn't have to deal with other people. So what he said was that all children, all human beings were born tabula rasa. That means table blank or blank table or blank slate is how it's usually translated. That when we are born, we are essentially blank tablets, blank individuals, and that it's our experiences that change us into the individuals that we become. This gets to the very heart of a psychological dispute that rages still to this day called the nature versus nurture controversy. Those who support the nature idea would say that we are born who we are, that we are the product of our genes, that we are born with our basic personality and basic abilities and lack of abilities in place from the beginning. Those who fall on the nurture side, like John Locke, say that we are blank slates, and it is our experiences, it's our environment, how we're nurtured and how we're raised, and our experiences that make us the people that we are. So what are the results of the Enlightenment? Well, first, a reading revolution, increased literacy throughout Europe. So much good stuff is being written in this period that people want to read it and learn how to read. There is a soaring rate of literacy in this period, more people acquiring the ability to read and write than before in Europe. Reading also becomes a popular individual activity, meaning a hobby for the middle classes. And I would love to tell you that they were reading the Philosophes and John Locke from England, and they were, but that's not their favorite form of literature. Their favorite form of literature in this period was an underground type of literature, meaning that it was considered to be not appropriate. It was pornographic material, which focused on the lifestyles of the rich and famous, of the aristocrats in Europe, and what they might actually be up to behind closed doors. This was considered to be controversial and highly offensive to governments because much of the subject of these pornographic novels were government officials and the aristocrats and what they might be doing. Also, new ideas about women's rights emerge in the Enlightenment. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting to you that in the Enlightenment, men like the Philosophes were demanding equal rights for women. They were not that enlightened. What they suggested in this period, the Philosophes, was that women should have the right to obtain an education, and to be precise, higher education, education at universities. It was very commonplace in this period for women to be declined or denied the right to further their education or to get education at all by society, but also by centers of learning, of institutions like colleges and universities denied women the right to be educated. These ideas about getting education for women developed in places called salons in France. A salon during the Enlightenment was an upper-class woman's living room, and the philosophers like Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau would select the living room of some upper-class woman or another to gather. And the living room would be beautifully decorated. Refreshments would be provided by the upper-class woman. She would invite her friends, male and female. They would publicize the event. Men and women would get together to talk about ideas such as nature versus nurture, how a government should work when it works well, etc., etc. And in the process of these discussions, women were allowed to participate, and the philosophers realized women have sense. Women have some good ideas. Perhaps we should campaign for them to get opportunities for higher education. So the idea of women's rights, of getting education for women, develops in this period. Also, result of the Enlightenment, so-called enlightened monarchs. Philosophers believed that the masses would not be able to bring about progress for society themselves, that they would have to get this progress and make society better by starting at the top of society. The masses were too stupid and uneducated, the philosophers thought, to bring about reform or progress to a country. They were powerless on top of that to make changes. So they started at the top and cultivated friendships with the monarchs of Europe. They were very careful in their works never to name names of monarchs who were absolutist. Instead, they worked with them as friends and on individual basis, and more or less tried to steer these monarchs away from absolutism and towards what they called enlightened rule of a country that would bring about progress and change for the betterment of the people. The results of the Enlightenment also include the American and French revolutions. As I said earlier, the ideas of Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau, and John Locke may seem commonplace to us, but they were revolutionary ideas, literally, for their time, to suggest that there was something other than absolutism for France was a revolutionary idea. And that ends our look at the educated elite's move towards a new worldview.